In the autumn of 1858, in the cloying humidity of Louisiana's St. James Parish, a contagion of fear crept through the sugarcane fields, thicker and more suffocating than the miasma that rose from the cypress swamps at dawn. It was a fear born not of phantom fever or spectral hauntings, but of a chillingly tangible event. Within the space of a single week, 3 of the parish's most powerful sugar planters, men who considered themselves kings of this humid, brutal domain, were struck down by a violent and inexplicable illness. The official pronouncement, delivered by a flustered parish doctor named Alastair Finch, was a particularly virulent strain of swamp fever, a diagnosis that settled over the community like a shroud, convenient in its familiarity, and yet utterly failing to quell the disquiet that lingered in the air. For the 3 men, Master Alastair Beaumont, Master Jean-Luc Dubois, and Master Philippe Chastain, had not succumbed in their own beds, isolated by sickness. They had died in sequence, with identical, horrifying symptoms, hours after attending a celebratory dinner at Belle Reve, the grandest of the parish plantations, a place whose name, beautiful dream, was a cruel irony understood only by those who toiled under its yoke. The dream was a nightmare, and its master, Alastair Beaumont, had been the first to die. The setting for this grim tableau was a land of violent contrasts, a place of opulent beauty built upon a foundation of profound human misery. The Mississippi River, a muddy god, coiled its way through the landscape, bestowing upon the soil a dark, alluvial richness that made the sugarcane grow thick and sweet. Live oak trees, ancient and gnarled, formed majestic alleys leading to the grand plantation houses, their branches draped with Spanish moss that hung like the tattered shrouds of forgotten ghosts. The air itself was a physical presence, heavy with the scent of jasmine, magnolia, and the ever-present, sickly sweet smell of boiling cane juice during the grinding season. It was a world governed by the rhythm of the crop, a relentless cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting that demanded a constant tribute of sweat and blood. The wealth of the sugar barons, as they were known, was staggering, their homes filled with French porcelain, Italian marble, and English silver, all of it purchased with the profits wrung from the bodies of the enslaved men, women, and children who worked the fields from Can't-see morn to Can't-see night. The law in St. James Parish was not a set of statutes written in a distant capital. It was the unwritten code of the planters themselves, a council of arrogant, powerful men who met over brandy and cigars to set the price of sugar and human flesh with equal detachment. Their authority was absolute, their cruelty a mundane and accepted fact of life, as natural to them as the oppressive summer heat. At the heart of this brutal system, at the apex of its power structure, sat Alastair Beaumont, the master of Belle Reve. He was not a man given to fits of violent rage or drunken sadism like some of his peers. His cruelty was of a colder, more terrifying variety. He was a man of ledgers and calculations, of profit and loss. He was tall and spare, with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them, assessing their worth with the dispassionate gaze of a butcher appraising livestock. He saw the hundreds of souls he owned not as human beings, but as assets, tools to be maintained, worked, and discarded when they were no longer productive. A healthy field hand was a valuable piece of machinery, a skilled artisan, a more complex but equally depersonalized instrument. His pride was not in his heritage or his name, but in the ruthless efficiency of his operation. Belle Reve produced more sugar per acre than any other plantation in the parish, a fact he attributed to his meticulous management of soil, cane, and labor. He was a pillar of his community, a respected member of the sugar baron's inner circle, and a man who believed, with the unshakable conviction of a zealot, in the divine and natural order of a world that placed him at its very top. Within the suffocating confines of this world lived a woman named Elara. To the master of Belle Reve and his frequent guests, she was simply the cook, a fixture of the household as permanent and functional as the great hearth in the kitchen where she worked. She was a woman of indeterminate age, her face a quiet mask that betrayed little of the thoughts that moved behind her dark, watchful eyes. She moved with a silent, economic grace, her presence in the great house so unobtrusive that she was often forgotten, a shadow gliding through hallways and dining rooms. This invisibility was her shield and her greatest weapon. While she appeared to be the model of subservience, a woman broken and molded by the system, Elara was a vessel of secrets. The first and most dangerous of these was that she could read and write, a skill taught to her in secret by the master's first wife, a kind and frail woman who had died years ago, leaving Elara with a forbidden key to a world of knowledge. Her second secret was buried deeper, a legacy passed down from her grandmother, an African healer who had carried the ancient knowledge of herbs and roots across the ocean in the chains of a slave ship. Elara knew the language of the earth. She understood the properties of every leaf, flower, and fungus that grew in the shadowed wetlands and fertile soil of the plantation. She knew which plants could heal a fever, soothe a wound, or ease a difficult birth. And she knew which ones could kill, with a subtlety that could mimic the deadliest of nature's own afflictions. The power dynamic between Alastair Beaumont and Elara was the central, unspoken truth of Belle Reve. It was an imbalance so total, so legally and socially absolute, that it was like a law of physics. He owned the body she inhabited, the hands that cooked his food, the hours of her day, and the future of the child she had borne. He could sell her, beat her, or kill her with near impunity, for the law was written by men like him to protect men like him. He valued her, but only in the way a man values a prized mare or a flawless diamond. Her culinary skill was a reflection of his own status, a testament to his good taste and wealth. He would often boast to his guests about her creations, the delicate sauces, the perfectly roasted meats, the airy pastries, never once using her name, referring to her only as my cook. He was utterly blind to the woman herself, to the keen, analytical mind that observed his every move, to the resilient spirit that had refused to be extinguished, and to the deep, cold well of rage that lay dormant within her, waiting for the one transgression that would finally cause it to overflow. He saw a possession. He was oblivious to the fact that he was living in the house of his future executioner. The transgression, when it came, was not an act of physical violence against Elara herself. It was something far worse, a cold, calculated business decision that struck at the one part of her soul that remained vulnerable, the one pure and untainted thing in her life, her daughter, Liana. Liana was 16, on the cusp of womanhood, with her mother's quiet grace and a spirit that had not yet been fully crushed by the world she had been born into. She was Elara's heart, her reason for enduring the unendurable. One sweltering afternoon, as Elara was supervising the churning of butter in the cool of the spring house, Master Beaumont approached her. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He spoke with the same detached tone he used to discuss the rotation of crops or the purchase of new mules. Liana is of age, he stated, his pale eyes fixed on some distant point over Elara's shoulder. She is a strong, healthy girl. I have made an arrangement with Master Dubois. His overseer, a man named Calloway, is a prime specimen. They will be paired. Their offspring will make for excellent field hands. He paused, a flicker of what might have been self-satisfaction crossing his thin lips. It is a sound investment for both plantations. The world seemed to tilt and fall away from Elara. The cool air of the spring house felt suddenly suffocating. Calloway. She knew the name. He was a notoriously brutal man, known for working his people to death and taking his pleasure with enslaved women as he pleased. The thought of Liana, her Liana, being handed over to such a man, being treated like a broodmare, caused something inside Elara to snap. It was not a loud, shattering break, but a quiet, cold, and final fracture. For years she had endured, she had survived, she had protected Liana as best she could, teaching her to be small, to be quiet, to be invisible. She had held on to a fragile sliver of hope that one day, somehow, things might change, that they might find a way to escape. But this was not a threat of violence. It was the calm, systematic annihilation of her daughter's humanity. It was the ultimate expression of Beaumont's worldview, that he and his kind had the right to plot the very course of their bloodlines, to breed human beings for strength and docility, as they would dogs or horses. In that moment, standing in the damp, quiet spring house, the years of suppressed rage, of meticulously observed injustices, of silent prayers for deliverance, coalesced into a single, diamond-hard point of resolve. Escape was no longer the goal. Flight was the act of the hunted. Justice, she now understood, was the act of the hunter. She would not run from the system. She would poison it at its very root. The shift within Ilara was imperceptible to the outside world. Her face remained a placid mask, her movements as efficient and silent as ever. But behind her eyes, a storm of cold fury was gathering, and a plan began to take shape, not in a flash of inspiration, but with the slow, methodical precision of a master weaver working at a loom. Her life, once a cycle of drudgery, was now a campaign of intelligence gathering. Her position as cook, which had once been the symbol of her servitude, was now her greatest strategic advantage. She was a ghost in the machine, a silent witness to the inner workings of the empire of sugar and pain. She moved through the great house, her senses sharpened, her mind a sponge, absorbing every detail, every whispered conversation, every boastful proclamation. She learned the intricate dance of power and politics among the sugar barons, who frequently gathered at Belle Reve for dinners that lasted late into the night. During these long evenings, as she served course after course of rich food and poured endless glasses of imported wine, she became an archivist of their sins. She listened as they discussed the purchase of a new shipment of Africans, complaining about the breakage, the men and women who had died during the Middle Passage, as if they were discussing damaged cargo. She overheard Beaumont laughing with Du Bois about a runaway they had hunted down with dogs, describing the man's terror as a source of great sport. She watched Chastain, a man whose piety in church on Sunday was legendary, drunkenly recount how he had sold a mother and her children to 4 different buyers in 3 different parishes, chuckling at the efficiency of the transaction. They spoke of human lives with the detached language of commerce and agriculture, using terms like stock yield and culling. Each word was a drop of fuel on the fire of Ilara's resolve. She memorized their habits, Beaumont's preference for a particular vintage of claret, Du Bois's gluttonous love for rich, creamy sauces, Chastain's weakness for a specific type of game bird. She noted their arrogance, their carelessness, their unshakable belief in their own invulnerability. They were gods in their own small world, and it never occurred to them that the silent, dark-skinned woman refilling their glasses was listening, judging, and passing a sentence they would never hear until it was too late. Her plan required more than just knowledge of her targets. It required resources and a confidant. She found both in Samuel, the plantation's blacksmith. He was a large, powerful man, his muscles forged by years of working the bellows and hammering hot iron. But his strength was matched by a quiet intelligence and a deep well of compassion. He had long loved Ilara from a distance, respecting the fierce, protective wall she had built around herself and Liana. In the weeks following Beaumont's decree, Samuel noticed the change in her. It was not in her actions, but in the stillness of her gaze, a new and unnerving intensity that spoke of a decision from which there was no return. One evening, under the guise of needing a pot mended, she went to the forge. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot metal. In the flickering firelight, she spoke to him, not of her full plan, that was a burden too dangerous for anyone else to carry, but of her need for his help. "They mean to give Liana to Calloway," she said, her voice low and steady, devoid of tears or pleading. "I will not allow it." Samuel's immediate instinct was to urge escape. "We can run," he whispered, his large hands clenching into fists. "Tonight. I know the routes through the swamp. We can make it to the north." Ilara shook her head slowly. "Running is not enough," she replied, her voice taking on a chilling finality. "A weed that is not pulled up by the root will always grow back. The root is here, in this house." Samuel saw the unshakable certainty in her eyes and understood that arguing was futile. His love for her, and his own deep-seated hatred for the masters, overrode his fear. He became her silent partner. He fashioned for her a small, intricately worked metal box with a false bottom, a place to store the dangerous herbs she would need to gather. He acted as her eyes and ears in the fields and workshops, reporting on the movements of the overseers and patrols. His presence was a silent comfort, a reminder that she was not entirely alone in her grim task, but the terrible weight of her true intentions remained hers and hers alone. The catalyst for the final act came with the announcement of a grand dinner. The harvest had been exceptionally profitable, and Alastair Beaumont, in his arrogance, decided to host a lavish celebration for his closest allies, the inner circle of the sugar barons. It was to be a feast to rival any in New Orleans, a testament to their success and their mastery over man and nature. The guests of honor were to be Jean-Luc Dubois and Philippe Chastain. When Elara heard the news, a profound and terrifying calm settled over her. This was the moment she had been planning for, the convergence of opportunity and readiness. The stage was set. In the days leading up to the dinner, she moved with a focused, almost reverent purpose. She journeyed deep into the swamp, to a place where the cypress knees broke the black water like skeletal fingers, a place few dared to go. There, she found what she was looking for, a rare, unassuming mushroom that sprouted from the decaying logs of fallen cypress trees. It was known to the old ones as the ghost cap, a fungus whose poison was insidious. It did not kill quickly. It worked slowly, mimicking the symptoms of the most virulent swamp fevers, uncontrollable shivering, a raging fire in the blood, delirium, and finally, a painful, agonizing paralysis that crept through the limbs until it stilled the heart. Its greatest advantage was its subtlety. It was nearly tasteless and left no trace that a common parish doctor would ever recognize as poison. She harvested the mushrooms with the careful hands of an apothecary, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm, like a drumbeat counting down the final hours of 3 men's lives. The night of the dinner arrived, a thick, moonless night heavy with the threat of rain. The great house of Belle Reve was ablaze with candlelight, the sound of laughter and music spilling out from the open windows into the darkness. Inside the dining room, the table was a spectacle of opulence, groaning under the weight of polished silver, crystal goblets, and fine china. Beaumont, Dubois, and Chastain sat at the head of the table, their faces flushed with wine and self-satisfaction, their voices loud as they toasted their own fortunes. In the kitchen, a world away, Elara presided over her own domain. The air was a maelstrom of heat and steam, the clatter of pots and pans a chaotic symphony. But at the center of it all, Elara was an island of preternatural calm. She moved with a dancer's grace, tasting a sauce here, adding a spice there, her focus absolute. For the main course, she had prepared roasted guinea fowl, a particular favorite of Master Chastain. As she plated the birds, she paused. From a small pouch tied at her waist, she took a fine, gray powder, the dried and pulverized ghost caps. She carefully dusted the portions destined for the 3 men of honor, watching as the powder dissolved invisibly into the rich, dark gravy. The plates were indistinguishable from the others. A young house servant carried them out to the dining room, an unwitting accomplice in an act of revolutionary justice. Elara watched him go, her expression unreadable, her work almost done. The trap, once laid, was sprung in agonizing slow motion. The feast was a triumph. The guests gorged themselves praising the master's cook for her artistry. Beaumont, expansive and magnanimous in his success, preened under the compliments. The poisoned men ate with gusto, Dubois sopping up every last drop of the lethal gravy with his bread. The wine flowed freely, and as the evening wore on, the men's conversation grew louder, their boasts more grandiose. Elara, having overseen the serving of dessert, retreated to the shadows of the kitchen, her work complete. She began the long process of cleaning, her hands moving mechanically, her mind a quiet, waiting void. The first sign that the poison was taking hold came hours later. The guests had departed, and a strange, tense silence had fallen over the house. A cry of pain echoed from the master's study. It was Chastain, who had stayed behind with Dubois and Beaumont for a final glass of brandy. He was doubled over, his face pale and beaded with sweat. Soon after, Dubois began to shiver uncontrollably, his teeth chattering despite the sweltering heat of the room. Beaumont, enraged and confused, at first blamed the wine. But when a wave of nausea and a burning fever seized him as well, a flicker of a different kind of fear entered his cold blue eyes. He bellowed for help, and a panicked house servant summoned Elara, the creator of the feast, to the study. When she entered the room, the scene was one of chaos and disbelief. The three most powerful men in the parish were reduced to frightened, sweating figures, their arrogance stripped away by the invisible fire consuming them from within. Beaumont, his face a mask of fury and terror, pointed a trembling finger at her. "The food," he rasped, his voice a dry croak. "What did you put in the food, woman?" This was the moment. The reckoning. Elara stood in the doorway, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The mask of subservience she had worn for a lifetime fell away, revealing the cold, hard face of a judge. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the quiet murmur of a servant. It was clear, steady, and utterly devoid of fear. "Do you remember the dinner 2 months ago, Master Beaumont?" she began, her tone conversational, yet chilling. "You were speaking with Master Dubois about the runaway Thomas. You laughed about how the dogs had tenderized his flesh. You said it was good sport." She turned her gaze to Dubois, who was now writhing on the floor. "And you, Master Dubois? You were so pleased with the sauce that night. You told Master Chastain that a well-fed slave was a productive slave, but that fear was the most important seasoning of all." Finally, she looked at Chastain, who was staring at her with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "And you, Master Chastain? You spoke of selling the child, Sarah, away from her mother. You called it trimming the fat from the ledger, your words, not mine." A dawning, horrified understanding began to spread across Beaumont's face. "You," he stammered, his voice choked with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You dare." Elara took a step into the room. "You spoke of us as livestock," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the silent, terrified room. "You breed us, you work us, you sell our children as if we are nothing more than beasts of the field. So I have tended to you as a farmer tends his herd. I have culled the sick, the corrupt, the ones who poison the ground they walk on." The poison was an artist of agony. It did not grant the mercy of a quick death. It was a meticulous deconstruction of the body, a mirror to the slow, systematic deconstruction of the soul that these men had practiced upon others for their entire lives. They were stripped of their power, their dignity, their very control over their own bodies. They twitched and moaned, their minds descending into a delirium filled with visions of their own victims, their final hours a tour of the hell they had created for so many others. Elara watched, her face impassive, her heart a cold, still stone. This was not an act of passion. It was a ceremony, a balancing of the scales. Samuel, true to his word, had created a distraction at the far end of the plantation, a small, controlled fire in a storage shed, drawing the attention of the overseer and the other house staff. No one came to help the masters. They died alone, in the opulent study where they had planned the ruin of so many lives, their final sounds not the commands of powerful men, but the terrified whimpers of cornered animals. Their justice was poetic, and it was absolute. The next morning, Belle Reve awoke to a world turned upside down. The discovery of the 3 dead masters sent a shockwave of panic and confusion through the household. The house servants, caught between terror and a secret, unspeakable relief, moved about in a daze. The official who was summoned to the gruesome scene was Dr. Alastair Finch, a man whose weary eyes had seen more than his share of the casual brutality of the planter class. He had long been troubled by the high mortality rates and the horrific injuries he was often called upon to treat in the slave infirmaries, his conscience warring with the professional necessity of silence. He examined the 3 bodies, noting the contorted limbs, the feverish pallor, the identical expressions of terror frozen on their faces. The official story from the panicked household staff was a sudden, violent illness that had struck them all at once. Dr. Finch conducted his examination, his mind racing. The symptoms were consistent with an exceptionally aggressive strain of swamp fever, a diagnosis that was both medically plausible and, more importantly, politically safe. To suggest poison, especially the poisoning of 3 men of such stature, would be to invite an investigation that would tear the parish apart, to unleash a wave of retributive violence upon the enslaved population that would be a bloodbath. He saw no obvious evidence of foul play, and perhaps, in a small, unexamined corner of his heart, he did not want to find any. He dipped his pen in the inkwell and wrote his official conclusion. Death by natural causes, attributed to a virulent miasmic fever. The matter, officially, was closed. The response from the surviving sugar barons was one of pure, unadulterated terror. The idea that 3 of their strongest, most protected members could be struck down by a random act of nature seemed impossible. They saw conspiracy in the shadows, the specter of a widespread slave revolt haunting their every waking moment. They doubled the patrols, enacted harsher punishments for the smallest infractions, and looked upon their enslaved workers with a new and potent paranoia. Yet, there was no evidence of a plot. No one confessed, no weapons were found, no whispers of rebellion were overheard. The poisoner had been a ghost. The authorities, represented by the parish sheriff, a corpulent, lazy man whose main interest was maintaining the status quo, were more than happy to accept Dr. Finch's diagnosis. A full-scale inquiry was the last thing anyone in power wanted. It would be bad for business, and it would expose the deep, rotten fissures in their society. And so, a cover story was silently agreed upon. It was a tragic, unfortunate act of God. The truth was buried, sealed away with the coroner's report, but the fear it had created lingered, a poison of a different kind, seeping into the foundations of the planter class. Amidst this chaos, Elara played her part to perfection. She was the picture of the loyal, grieving servant, her quiet sorrow so convincing that she earned the pity of the Beaumont relatives who arrived to squabble over the estate. The reading of Alastair Beaumont's last will and testament was expected to be a formality, a simple transfer of immense wealth to his distant cousins in Charleston. The family, a flock of vultures in mourning clothes, gathered in the study where their kinsman had died, their faces a mixture of feigned grief and greedy anticipation. The parish lawyer, a dry, reedy man named Thaddeus Crow, cleared his throat and unrolled the parchment. He read through the standard bequests and legal jargon until he reached the final, operative clause. He paused, blinked, and read it again to himself, a look of profound disbelief on his face. He cleared his throat once more. And as to the remainder of my estate, he read, his voice trembling slightly, including the property known as Belle Rev, all lands, buildings, and chattel therein, I bequeath it in its entirety to. He stopped, looking up at the expectant faces. The room was silent. I bequeath it, he repeated, his voice now a shocked whisper. To my cook Elara. A collective gasp filled the room. The will was a final, posthumous act of pure spite from a man who despised his own family. Months earlier, in a fit of pique after a bitter argument with his cousins over money, Beaumont had secretly altered his will. He had, as a grand insult, named his most loyal and valuable property as his sole heir, never for a moment believing the clause would ever be executed. It was meant to be a cruel joke, a final testament to his belief that his cook was more valuable than his own blood. But in the rigid, property-obsessed legal system of the South, a man's will was sacrosanct. The document was legally ironclad. The law, which had been the instrument of Elara's oppression, had, through a bizarre twist of fate and a dead man's arrogance, become the instrument of her liberation. She, a woman who had been owned, was now the owner, the mistress of Belle Rev. The news of Elara's inheritance sent a new shockwave through the parish, one of disbelief and outrage. But the law was the law. The remaining planters, already spooked by the mysterious deaths, were at a loss. They could not legally challenge the will without undermining the very legal principles of property and inheritance upon which their entire society was built. They were caught in a trap of their own making. A fourth, junior partner in Beaumont's sugar enterprise, a younger man from the north named Julian Croft, arrived to assess the chaotic situation. Croft was a pragmatist, not an ideologue. He saw the seething unrest, the fear in the eyes of the masters, and the fragile, volatile state of the entire region. He met with Elara, expecting to find a simple-minded servant overwhelmed by her new circumstances. Instead, he found a woman of unnerving intelligence, dignity, and calm authority. He saw that the old way of doing things at Belle Rev was over. In a move that stunned the parish, he offered to stay on not as her master, but as her paid estate manager, to help her navigate the complexities of her new fortune. An alliance was formed, one born of necessity and a shared understanding that the world was changing. Elara accepted. Her reign had begun. The ripple effects of the Night of Three Fevers, as it came to be known in hushed whispers, were profound and lasting. A deep, superstitious fear took root among the planter class of St. James Parish and beyond. The swift, inexplicable, and natural demise of three of their most powerful members served as a chilling cautionary tale. The casual, everyday brutality that had been the norm began to recede, not from a sudden blossoming of conscience, but from a new, primal fear. Masters began to look at their servants with a flicker of doubt, wondering what hidden thoughts lay behind their subservient masks. A slave who fell ill was now a source of alarm, not annoyance. A cook who was too quiet was viewed with suspicion. Elara's act, though its true nature was known only to her and Samuel, had fundamentally altered the psychological landscape. She had introduced a new variable into the equation of power, the terrifying possibility that the oppressed were not merely passive victims, but could be agents of a terrible and invisible retribution. The whip and the branding iron were still tools of control, but they were now wielded with a new and hesitant hand. Elara, the new mistress of Belle Reve, became a figure of legend. She never spoke of the night of the dinner, never acknowledged the source of her incredible fortune. She moved through her new life with the same quiet dignity she had always possessed. Her first act as a free woman was to formally emancipate Liana and Samuel, a declaration she signed herself in a clear, steady hand. They were married not long after, a quiet ceremony under the ancient oaks that had once symbolized her bondage. With Julian Croft's help, Elara began to use her immense wealth and power in a methodical, systematic way. She became a secret force in the abolitionist movement. She used her fortune to buy the freedom of enslaved families, often purchasing them at auction through intermediaries, and then arranging for their safe passage to the north. Belle Reve itself was transformed. The brutal gang labor system was abolished, replaced by a system of paid labor for those who chose to stay. The infirmary was expanded, and for the first time, its purpose was to heal, not merely to patch up workers to be sent back to the fields. The story of the cook who inherited a fortune was told and retold in the slave quarters across the South. It morphed and grew with each telling, becoming a powerful myth. Some said she was a voodoo queen who had commanded the spirits to strike down her enemies. Others said an angel had come down and passed a divine judgment. Whatever the version, the core of the story remained the same, a testament to the idea that the seemingly powerless held a power of their own, that justice, however long delayed, would eventually find its mark. Her individual act of vengeance had become a symbol of collective hope, a spark of inspiration in the long, dark night of slavery. In the grand tapestry of American history, the events at Belle Reve were a single, almost invisible thread. Yet they were part of a larger pattern of resistance, a prelude to the great and terrible conflict that was to come. The quiet war Elara waged in her kitchen was a microcosm of the irrepressible conflict brewing between a nation's stated ideals of liberty and its brutal reality of human bondage. Years later, long after the Civil War had ripped the country apart and remade it, a historian researching parish records from the 1850s would stumble upon Dr. Finch's report on the deaths of Beaumont, Du Bois, and Chastain. Tucked away in the file, he would find a small, private addendum, written in the doctor's own shaky hand, dated years after the event. It read, "I have come to believe that the fever which took those men was not born of the swamp's miasma, but of a long-simmering malady of the soul. It was not a sickness of the body that felled them, but a justice, swift and terrible, for a sickness of the spirit. I treated the symptom, but I believe a woman named Elara cured the disease." The note was a quiet confirmation of a truth that had been hidden for decades, a final testament to an act of resistance that had been deliberately erased from the official narrative. Years passed. The world changed. Elara lived to a great old age, a matriarch presiding over a free and prosperous Belle Reve. She watched her daughter Liana raise her own children in freedom, children who would never know the feel of a lash or the terror of the auction block. She remained a quiet, enigmatic figure, her past locked away behind her watchful eyes. One evening, as she sat on the veranda with an elderly Liana, looking out over the fields now worked by free hands under a golden sunset, Liana finally asked the question she had held in her heart for a lifetime. "Mother," she said softly, "that night, were you afraid?" Elara was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The Spanish moss on the distant oaks swayed gently in the evening breeze, no longer like funeral shrouds, but like the soft, gray hair of venerable elders. "Fear is a privilege of those who have something left to lose," Elara said finally, her voice as clear and steady as it had been on the night of the reckoning. "That day in the spring house, your master took the last thing I had. After that, all that was left was a debt to be paid." She turned to her daughter, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "Justice burns slower than coal, but my child, it burns complete." It was a final, haunting reflection on the nature of memory and survival, on the unbending power of a single human will against an inhuman system. They had thought they owned her body. They never understood that, in the end, she owned their lives.